Kia ora, no mai, haere mai. Welcome to OANZ's webinar series. And tonight is a real big focus on policy and how we can improve and do that better. It's been a big week for the organic sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've just got confirmation that we have an Associate Minister for Agriculture specialising in organic. And together with that, we've also got our work with our Ministry of Primary Industries, where we're sort of winding down on finalising our regulations and ramping up our work on our growth strategies. So it's great to be a part of that. So the timing of tonight is absolutely perfect. I'll do a brief introduction now to both speakers we have tonight. From the OANZ board, we have Alistair Schorn, and Alistair's a really important part of our work in terms of working with the Green Deal. There was a project OANZ with MPI funding did quite a piece of work on, and also our market report with our immediate past CEO, Tiff Tompkins. So that's great to have you here, Alistair. And
Thank you,
it's a
Brendan.
great pleasure also to have Nic Lampkin. And Nic is, well, look what I brought with me. This is what used to be the Bible of organic agriculture globally, published in 1990, I think, Nic. And everybody's sort of got this brick of a thing that was really valuable in
Have you read
documenting
it?
the whole piece. Yeah. And so great to have you here, Nic, and the work you've done recently in reviewing the whole sort of situation in Europe. It's a great pleasure to have you. So before we kick in, Lou, can you take us through some do's and don'ts and a bit of a protocol for tonight, please?
Absolutely. Just letting everyone know we are recording tonight and we will send the recording out to everybody probably early next week. We do have a chat function and we've got a Q&A on the webinar tonight. So if you want to just talk between yourselves or share information, feel free to do that in the chat. If you have any specific questions for Nic or Alistair or Brendan or myself, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them when the time is right. Otherwise, any problems, you can send me a direct message. Thank you.
Awesome, Lou. Thank you. So first of all, we're going to be starting with Alistair to give us some context around the Green Deal and New Zealand's work in assessing that and its relativity to New Zealand. So Alistair, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Can everybody see my screen that's now being shared? Okay, fabulous. All right. So this is, by way of introduction, this is a, sorry, I'm just going to move that. There we go. This is a very brief synopsis of the work that we did, Tiffany, our former CEO of OANZ, and myself in 2023 on the implications of the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy for New Zealand's primary producers. This was done in the period before the NZ EU Free Trade Agreement entered into force, but the text was pretty well finalized. So for the most part, we knew what we were working with. And as you can see there, it was funded by our Land and Water Toitu Te Whenua Toyota Te Wai National Science Challenge. So if we crack straight into it, next slide, there we go. Okay, so the questions we were trying to answer, the first two were really not specific to organic production, but more to primary production as a whole. But what we did was a bit of a Jedi mind trick to benefit organic producers, and that was in the third question around how organic production and starting the process of organic conversion can mitigate the risks of trade disruption from free trade agreements and promote access, in this case, to the EU market for New Zealand's organic producers. And just to note that we also did a piece of follow-on research which asked essentially the same questions about the UK free trade agreement. So this was the title of the paper we did. We really tried to focus on the economic rationale. We had some case studies looking at the size of organic opportunities in the EU, specifically for wine and dairy. And the reason we chose these sectors was that although they are relatively small in the context of New Zealand's total production, we saw that there was a real opportunity for organic producers in those spaces to get a premium and to gain market access. And just in terms of some context on the size of the EU market for organics, I've been doing some work recently with projections around the size of the EU organic market, and it's forecast to grow to $330 billion by 2035, with a compound annual growth rate of more than 12%. The biggest sectors within that are fruit and veg, meat, fish and dairy, and poultry. So when we started looking into the EU Green Deal regulations, we found that it's really this sort of intertwined spaghetti ball of complementary and mutually supportive pieces of legislation, and it's quite difficult to pull stuff out and analyze any single piece of legislation in isolation. But we looked into it and we found that there were 4 areas that we thought at the time were some of the critical ones for New Zealand producers. The first one was that area of pesticides and agrochemicals. And then we thought that would be a big deal because at the time, the EU's list of banned agrochemicals was 195 items and New Zealand's banned chemicals was only 27 items. So we thought the scale of difference there might be a real problem for our exporters, because the EU regulations would have just let the EU ban products that contained traces of those chemicals that are banned in the EU. Now, obviously, the irony is not lost to us that there's a fair few of those products that were probably banned in the EU that were made by companies that are based in the EU, but that's a conversation for another day. So, yeah, Nick, I mean, maybe something for you to circle back to. I don't think this ever really got out of the starting gate, and I'm not sure where it sits at the moment. The second one was the EU Green Claims Directive, which was aimed at eliminating greenwashing. Now, the last time I looked, that there was an update in June last year where it seemed to be that piece of legislation was in a bit of a limbo in the EU. So yeah, I'm not sure where that's going to go. The third one was the sustainability labeling scheme, which seems to have become the EU eco-label. As far as I can make out, that's become a voluntary system that's been really overwhelmingly picked up by EU producers for their own products. There were some figures that I saw on one of the EU's web pages. As of September 2025, the EU eco-label covered 116,000 products from 3,500 producers, and 97% of those producers were based in the EU. So there might be some opportunities down the line for New Zealand producers to get certified for that EU eco-label and get their products to take advantage of increased market access into the EU. There's probably a bit more to unpack around in that space around the EU organic label and what the situation might be in terms of equivalence between the EU and New Zealand. And I've got some more content on that in a couple of slides down the road. And then the last issue that we looked at was the one that was around deforestation in third countries. So, which was potentially a big deal for New Zealand beef producers. What that legislation says is that for a range of products imported into the EU, cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, soy, wood, and for related products, in our case meat, the producers or the importers need to prove that their products are not associated with deforestation that took place after 31st of December 2020. And the reason that's significant for New Zealand producers is that New Zealand is the world's largest largest importer of what? Palm kernel expeller, which is obviously used as a cattle feed and is heavily associated with deforestation in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Borneo. So what that regulation said is that basically the onus is on New Zealand producers to prove that there aren't bits of orangutan and Sumatran tiger floating around in the steak or the mince that they send over to Europe. So as far as I understand, this piece of legislation is also being simplified. countries are being categorized as high, medium, or low risk, and they have different burden of proof requirements accordingly. Importantly, it doesn't apply to dairy at this point, but there's no reason to think that that list of products can't be expanded again in the future. So again, Nick, anything you might be able to provide us with insights on that, we'd be very happy to hear them. So moving on, the other issues we looked at were some of those border policies around carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are things that will apply to exporters of products to the EU when they don't participate in some sort of domestic emissions trading scheme, or they aren't subject to some sort of domestic emissions payment system. If they don't, they'll need to then buy EU emissions trading scheme credits, which will obviously increase the cost of these products in imports into the EU, and put the idea is to put them on an equal footing with EU products that are subject to the emissions trading scheme in the EU. So these typically will apply to high emission products: cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, hydrogen. They don't apply to primary products yet, but again, I'm sure that when the EU can navigate their way through a new version of their common agricultural policy, that's something that they might look at in the future. And last year, or not last year, the year before, we had a report that was released by the Aotearoa Circle that put the percentage of New Zealand's exports that are potentially exposed to carbon border adjustment mechanisms at 40% by value. And then the second piece of it was those behind the border policies around climate disclosure and ESG disclosure. And the Aotearoa Circle report again put that percentage at about 70 to 80% of current New Zealand exports by value being exposed to some sort of climate or sustainability disclosure scheme. And as you can see at the bottom there, there we go, sorry, wrong one. There's a consultation on the go at the moment on a revision of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and there's a potential for a voluntary reporting mechanism for smaller companies, and that consultation is live at the moment. So moving on, let's just see, I've covered all that. Yep. Right.
Alistair, you got 3 minutes, mate.
Okay, cool. All right. So, and this is the one thing that I want to draw people's attention to. This is a bit of an elephant in the room, or maybe a herd of elephant. These are quotes taken directly from the text of the New Zealand EU Free Trade Agreement that covers the article that covers trade and climate change. Now, there's paragraph 3 in particular. I will leave it to all of our participants and our audience members to figure out and draw their own conclusions about the extent to which the policies that we've seen over the past 3 years, and even in as recently as this week, might or might not be in contravention of that little paragraph in the Free Trade Agreement. Be that as it may, that's I want to circle back now just as a conclusion to where we are in the organic regime in New Zealand. So obviously we had the Organic Products and Production Act passed in April of 2023. We had, we had the regulations that came into force last year in September. There's a 3-year transition period. And we've got some ongoing consultations on the Organic Standard Notice. And of course, then the big news, as Brendan mentioned, is that Minister Butterick has been given, Associate Minister Butterick has been given responsibility for the organic sector. And then the last piece, as far as the EU is concerned, the organic equivalency negotiations are still pending. Now, the initial deadline for all those negotiations to happen from the EU side was December of 2026. But I've picked up today that there's a proposal on the table and out for consultation at the moment to extend the current regime to December 2036. And when I picked up on this, I had a quick discussion this afternoon with Derek Broadmoor, who's, of course, our incredibly knowledgeable representative on the MPI Organic Sector Advisory Council. And his view was that, well, this really, any changes on the EU side really won't affect our development of the organic regime in New Zealand, because, of course, we want to take advantage of that regime to negotiate equivalency with other markets, including the US. So that's basically all from me. Apologies that this was a real whistle-stop tour through our research from a few years ago, but Nic, I look forward to hearing your insights as to the state of play for organics in the EU, and maybe touch on some of the regulatory bits that I've been through. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alistair. Hey, before, Nic, you proceed, is there any question you've got of Alistair for clarification, or anything you'd like to probe a bit on that, what you've heard? Or would you prefer to proceed? Alistair, I've got a question for you. Of those sort of initial themes that you thought of, that, you know, the pesticide, the greenwashing, the eco-label, what is still the most prevalent, you think, as a priority? What is something that is a real...
Well, I mean, you know, Nic will be able to give us a little bit of insight into the sort of broader political environment and the negotiation environment in the EU. I would suggest that the one that might just, you know, sort of be a bit sticky is the avoided deforestation in third countries one. That is the one that got out the starting gate. You know, there was an impact. As I say, beef and lamb, New Zealand were sort of in the crosshairs of that to some extent. So I think that's probably the one piece of regulation that did make it out of the starting gate, and that will probably, in some way, shape, or form, it might be simplified, it might, be pulled back a little bit, but avoided deforestation in third countries has always been a big deal, ever since I've been working in the sustainability field.
Great. Thank you very much, Alistair. Nic, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute. I'm going to share my slides, just a second. So I'm hoping this will work successfully. Okay, so firstly, just it's nice to be back in contact with New Zealand. I spent some time about 35 years ago making my little contribution to the organic sector in New Zealand. Now I've reached the pleasure of retirement, and after a period working in Germany, so I'm now working a little bit independently. The issues we're trying to pick up, I'm going to pick up, are actually coming out of a project we've just completed when I was working at the Thunen Institute in Germany on the organic targets for the EU. So they're very much focused on organic policy and policy recommendations for targeting producers within the EU, but I'm trying to bridge it a bit to the broader themes. One of the things that has come up already in the presentation from Alistair and in previous discussion is a little bit, just a quick update on where the EU is in policy making at the moment, because with the rightward shift in politics in many EU countries, there's been a de-emphasizing of quite a few of the environmental policies, particularly following the farmer protests and tires burning on the streets of Brussels and various other dramatic initiatives a couple of years ago. And quite a few of the regulations that were proposed as part of the Green Deal have been either slowed down or ditched, and some of the targets. So I think you just have to watch this space a bit, because now the whole focus is on the next policy period from 2028 to 2036. They're really trying to get all of that sorted out, and the other regulations and so on are taking a back seat. One of the ones that did get through before this shift took place was the nature restoration law. And that, I think, is something that could be potentially relevant in future in terms of the commitments to international biodiversity agreements to increase the level of biodiversity in the farming systems. But maybe we can pick up some of the other issues in questions moving on. So I'm hoping now I can get this to behave itself. So while there's been a sort of a shift away from the Green Deal targets on pesticides and fertilizer use and antibiotic use and so on, organic still remains something of significant interest within the European Union, in part because it's a system-based approach delivering multiple environmental benefits, but linked to a very clear market opportunity with economic implications. So that whereas most policies for the environment don't have that market link, organic is quite unique in having a very close link to the marketplace. I'm not going to go through all these benefits, but there's good research evidence within the EU context relating to most of these. And even generation renewal at the end is now one of the big interesting points, because the statistics show that there's a much higher prevalence of young people farming organically compared with non-organically. So it's also seen in that context. Firstly then is the key policy that came out of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy was that there should be a target for organic farming to reach 25% of EU farmland by 2030. It's currently at about 11.5%. 15 to 18% we project is achievable by 2030 in practice. So we're not going to get there by 2030, but it's not out of the question. Maybe between 2035 and 2040, things are moving roughly in the right direction. You can see from this chart here from 20,000 where there was about 4 million hectares from 2000 to 2024, where we got to about 18 million hectares. There's been a steady growth at the European level, which is in fact a doubling every 10 years. There has been a slowdown in growth in 2024, which we attribute to some of the difficulties in the marketplace, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also the time lag associated with conversion. So it's a bit difficult to predict. So that's the latest data we have. It's a bit difficult to predict where that's going to go in future. But I think the targets that we're looking at is there. Now, you could say, well, are these targets a waste of time if we're not going to reach them by 2030? Very clearly from the policy-making framework, these targets weren't a waste of time. They provided a clear signposting. The Commission was able to work with member states to upgrade organic policy in many countries on the back of the targets. So this sort of ambition or motivational characteristic of targets is an important issue. Of course, individual countries need to also have realistic targets so that they make sure the resources are available, but that's something that we'll come back to. So the second aspect of policy that I want to pick up on is the strong environmental focus behind organic policy. Organic conversion and maintenance support has existed since 1994 as an agri-environmental measure. The conversion support helping with restructuring the farm and getting it through the conversion period. The maintenance payments on an ongoing basis, recognizing the environmental benefits that are being delivered and compensating for those in relation to the income foregone. So I just give you here, varying on country, it varies quite considerably between countries. Payments are between 100 and 400 euros per hectare on arable land, grassland somewhat less. There's also relevant to production level are investment aids, which is available to all farmers, but organic may have a higher share of the total cost paid, or might have a priority eligibility criterion attached. From 2023 to 2027, which is the current CAP period, the EU has planned with its member states for 10% of farmland to be supported as organic by 2027, which is equivalent to about 15% being certified organic, because not all land does get supported. And it accounts for about 5% of total CAP funds for these direct or specific organic support, or 20% of the environmental expenditure. So you can see organic is now mainstream within the European policy context. And from 2028, there are plans to further develop organic policy. It was anticipated that it might be a victim of the shift away from the Green Deal, but the Commission has, in its proposals for the next period, has kept organic as one of 6 environmental priorities, and introduced some ideas. I have to say there are currently lots of battles going on with the Council of Ministers representing the individual countries and the European Parliament, with the more right-wing oriented governments opposing some of these proposals. So we still need to see what emerges from the negotiation process. This just gives you a quick idea of how countries are developing. You can see it's extremely variable. The 3 columns of data I've got here is 2018, the certified area, the 2024 certified area. So you can see some countries like Portugal, I'll go through these in a minute, have expanded quite rapidly. And then the target that each country has set, Austria being the highest at 35% of the land area to be organic, in the green column. And I'll just pick up a couple of examples. Estonia is one where the targets and the actual area are fairly close together, and may well be achievable by 2030. Germany, where the target was set way above where the country actually is in terms of production, and it's unlikely to be achievable. Portugal, where for various reasons they've had a very high rate of expansion in the last few years and are now ahead of their target, even though it was quite ambitious. And Sweden as the one country in Europe which has seen a significant decline in organic land area over the last 5 years, and where there's quite a lot of discussion around what has happened there and why that's the case. But what you get is a very mixed picture. Some countries expanding very slowly or stagnant, and other countries expanding very fast. Some with high targets, some with low targets. They're all in different situations. So it's what you see as an average across the European level can't be necessarily interpreted at the individual country level. The second area that I wanted just to cover is market-focused support. The idea is to make organic as appealing and as easily accessible as possible, trusted through the regulations. We've had the organic regulations since 1992, strong base for market development, but it's also enabled the inclusion of organic farming because it has a legal definition in many of the policy initiatives. So that's been a really important side effect of the regulation. There are some particular areas of activity that the EU encourages, one of which is public procurement in schools and hospitals and so on. Various countries have quite ambitious targets. So France, for example, has a legal requirement, not just a target, but a legal requirement for 22% of the produce used in catering both in private sector and in public sector, to be organic. And Copenhagen has a target of 90% organic, which is pretty much achieved with 1,000 kitchens, and it's done it at no extra cost through menu adjustments and innovations in the processing and preparation of the products. So there's a lot of training, advice, and various other things come into that. It's not just a question of setting a target. And then building consumer demand through promotion activities. You've got a picture on the right here, which showing the Irish promotion campaign, where they've been trying to also sell organic products onto the continent as part of their export drive. So we've got promotion campaigns, but there's also big issues about the way organics is presented in retail outlets, the availability of labeling. And I'll just highlight here on the extreme right the Danish bronze, silver, gold approach to out-of-home catering. Every restaurant you go to is pretty much certified now according to its inclusion of organic within the catering thing. So if it's bronze, it's 30 to 60% organic, and if it's gold, it's 90 to 100% organic. So this is taken as a really serious issue within out-of-home catering in the Danish context. The market growth on the back of all of these policies has been quite substantial. It's grown roughly threefold every 10 years. So from about 5 billion in 2000 through to about 50 billion now. Maybe the growth rates that Alistair talked about would be achievable if that continued. But there has been a slowdown, which is clearly linked to the pandemic on the one hand, where we saw increased ahead of normal rates, an increased demand for organic products as people went to eating at home more and maybe were more health conscious in their consumption patterns. When COVID finished, they went back to eating out of home and the consumption rates slowed down. And then, of course, the Ukraine invasion led to food price inflation problems. So we saw in 21-22 a reduction both in value and volume terms. We've now seen gradually the situation improving again, so that in 2024 and the data from 2025 that's coming through now, we see both volume and value increases in many of the markets. Germany is a good case in point, where the organic market is growing quite rapidly, but the supply is failing to keep up with that. And particularly in the dairy sector, organic premiums have gone up from 10% to nearly 75% in the last 12 months. So if you're looking at what New Zealand might be exporting to the EU, then of course picking your target market quite carefully and picking your product is probably quite important.
Nic, 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm nearly done. Knowledge and innovation support is the other big area of policy support, where the EU has got quite a lot of programs in place, and they're used to fund organic activity. Information is seen as really key for the further expansion of organic farming. If the 25% target is to be met, we estimate that about 1 million more professionals, farmers, and all the people that work with the farmers will need access to organic information. And by people who work with farmers, we're not just including advisors and trainers, but also all the people working with the government officials working with farmers, the nature conservation agencies working with farmers, the bankers and financial institutions working with farmers, and of course all of the food processors and retailers that work with farmers. They all need better information about organic and the opportunities. So it's a big issue as to how that can be achieved. Advice, training, peer-to-peer groups, mentoring, online platforms, these all exist to a greater or lesser extent in different countries, and there's mechanisms to support their development. Research and farmer-led innovation is also widely available both at EU level and at national level, but there is a clear need to maintain a specific organic focus, and some of that is being lost within the current emphasis on regenerative and so on as an alternative option. So that's something that we need to be working on. But one of the key issues that we've identified is that you don't just want to be thinking about projects because they have a defined lifetime. You need to also be thinking about building capacity. Teams, organizations are really important if you want the ideas to be able to develop over a longer period of time. And the last area of knowledge and innovation that we've identified as critically important is having good statistics and market data, critical for farmer business and policy decision making, also needed for research. Having a legally defined organic status means you can also more easily include organic indicators in mainstream data collections. But there's also quite a lot of scope to make better use of certifier data, which hasn't really happened very much in the European context yet. And then I bring together the last area of policy that I wanted to cover was the area of organic action plans. These are now widespread. The European Union encouraged all member states to implement action plans. And as of 2023, all but 3 countries had within the EU organic action plans in place. The EU uses its own action plan really to provide guidance to member states on where they could individually improve their organic policies. But there's also a need to make sure that organic action plans are well defined and developed, and there's plenty of scope in the examples that we've looked at from member states to do that. A clear idea for action plans is that it's integrating both supply push type policies, the environmental policies, and demand pull, the market policies, which is also integrating public and private sector priorities within that process. It's also about making sure that you have a good strategic analysis to start with and a good monitoring and evaluation process to check on progress. We did produce over in earlier projects a manual for organic action plans, which is available on the iPhone website. So if ever you get that far with the policy discussions, then that's something that you might find helpful to look at. And that's where I come to an end. I think I've done it within the 5 minutes you said I had left.
Actually, you've got another minute, Nic. So,
well, I've got this slide here just to say we have produced in the last phase of the Organic Targets for Europe project a series of material that is on the Organic Targets for Europe website, including fact sheets about all 27 member states plus 2 other countries, Norway and Switzerland, with statistical and policy summaries of where they're at. 12 policy briefs covering the main areas that I've talked about today, and some detailed reports on the way policy is implemented within the European Union. So if you are a policy nerd and want to get into the detail, the deliverables are a place to look.
Great.
That's
Nic, I've just shared those URLs in the chat, so if anybody wants to access them, the links are directly in the chat now.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Lou. Alistair, before I go to you for a question and then we'll open it up, I do have a question for you, Nic, which I did pose to you prior, is you've been at the deep end of the organic game for decades and seen a lot of, both in the UK and in the EU and globally. Here we are in New Zealand, where you were 20 years ago, with policy being formed, regulation, the ink is still drying. Knowing what you know now, what would you recommend, given the current climate we're in, and you were talking about there's a shift to the right, it's not just an EU thing, there's clearly a global sort of shakedown going on. What would you prioritise for New Zealand as, say, top 3 policy or 5, whatever? What would you knowing what you know now, what would you focus on?
Or challenging. I think for me, one of the key issues is that it's really important to, in a policy framework, to maintain both the perspective on the environment and public goods and on the marketplace.
Yeah.
If we get too focused on the marketplace, we lose contact with the roots of organic farming, the principles, and that actually gets picked up by consumers and so on and looked at critically. So I think we need to keep that. We call it the duality in the European policy context, the duality of organic farming covering both environmental public good type issues and market issues. We need to. It's always a challenge for policymakers to get the right balance between those issues, but that's why action plans can be really helpful in making sure that balance is there. So I think if, it's about saying, if you've got climate targets that New Zealand is trying to push and seeing how to integrate with the European climate policies, taking a serious look at how organic fits within that is really important. And I think there is, we talk in our policy recommendations about some of the options that we have for shifting policy to remunerate environmental outcomes more directly. I think that's something that we could be working on. Cool. I think the second thing that I would really emphasize is that the market can carry a lot and pull a lot along with it, but you need to have the information issue addressed to go along with that. It's an essential part of it. That's the advice, the research, the statistics. If you've got crap data, it's very difficult for businesses to make decisions as to whether they should get involved or not. So you really need to get that bit sorted. And so I would emphasize those two bits. And the last bit I would say is they've got to provide a stable base from which the market can develop. So there's no point having a stop-start approach on policy, which then is very disruptive to the marketplace. If you really want the market to be the driver that then carries things through.
Right. Perfect. Lou, there's a question in the Q&A, but Alistair, did you have a follow-through question that you might have before we go to Lou? No? You're on mute.
Apologies. No, I'm all good, Brendan. Thanks.
Lou.
I've just got a couple of questions in the Q&A. One is from Chris Morrison. Hi, Nic. Thanks for your presentation. Can you shed any light on what premiums for organic products in the EU? I understand this will vary depending on the product. Is the difference widening or reducing?
It's highly variable depending on the product area. It's not as high as many people expect. So it is. I wish I had another slide that I could show you now just to illustrate it. The issue is actually looked at in the long term. Organic prices have tended to be quite stable and not necessarily. So if you take the main commodities like milk or cereals, it's not necessarily linked to conventional prices. So then you can have something like the Ukraine crisis comes along. Feed and energy prices are pushed up rapidly. Conventional prices go up rapidly. And we got a situation where the organic price only went up slightly, and the conventional price went up hugely, and the premium disappeared. So, but then what's happened afterwards is that the conventional prices have fallen again. Organic has fallen slightly, and there's been a big widening of the gap. So, I think the one of the key issues for farmers and for the organic sector to keep in mind is to actually say, yes, we have some stability in organic prices, which is something we can build on, and maybe we should ignore some of the big variability or volatility in price premiums because of what's happening in volatility in the conventional sector.
Nic, on that, do we see the same thing on the cost side in organic production? So are the costs stable, and the costs in conventional production are massively variable with fertilizer prices or anything like that? Is there been any research on that piece of it?
Yeah, well, over the last few years, of course, with the Ukraine crisis and everything, the fertilizer and feed prices have been quite variable. Fertilizer prices certainly been highly variable under conventional systems. And one of the issues that is why the food price inflation came about was because the markets responded by increasing the price to producers to help them cover the cost of the increased fertilizer. So there was I had anticipated actually that a sort of sharp increase in fertilizer prices might encourage more people to convert. It didn't happen because there was this adjustment in prices for milk and so on, and cereals and so on, that allowed the farmers to cover those costs. But we have seen it in countries like Ireland, where they didn't get such a big increase in the prices that they were being paid conventionally, and so organic became more interesting due to high fertilizer costs. So you get that volatility. Now, organic is protected from that volatility because it's not using some of the fertilizers that are particularly sensitive to energy prices, like nitrogen fertilizer. But there will be some effects on. So there will be, obviously, if diesel prices or heating oil go up substantially, then everyone is affected by that, and organic is affected by it just the same. There are then, of course, other areas where the volatility that the organic sector faces, for example, in feed prices for livestock, are determined by the overall market situation for organic cereals and so on. That then is more of an organic factor than it is sort of a knock-on from the conventional sector. But I think we've tried very hard, and it's not successful necessarily because the premium price is what farmers can see most obviously. There is a real need to actually look at the overall profitability situation, taking account cost as well, before farmers make decisions about conversion one way or the other.
Okay, thanks, Nic. I've got one more question in the chat from John. The non-GMO project has been big in the US. How is the consumer interest in non-GMO extending into the organic sector in Europe?
The GMO issue has been a sort of fundamental issue for organic in Europe for the last 20 years, and it is very much tied into the regulations. The EU was, for a long time, also on the skeptical side of GMOs in terms of general regulations. So it was they were easier bedfellows, if you want. However, that now the sort of desire to remove some of the environmental constraints, which they've also done on pesticide registration and so on, means that there will be more GMO products allowed within the European framework than was previously the case. And how that will develop over time in relation to the organic regulations and organic standards we need to see. But I think at the moment, consumers very clearly see that organic is a non-GMO product, and if that's what they're looking for, then they will use that as an identifying factor moving forward.
Is there a non-GMO label like they have in the US, in Europe?
No, not really.
Really, not in the same way.
There are, I say not really. There would be some individual products that might, or brands that might emphasize it, but it's not really a sort of clear label like that.
Thanks.
Lou, I have a follow-on question. Well, it's slightly changing tack, Nic, and it's partly around capacity building, which is one of the platforms OANZ is pushing for in our election manifesto. We have an election this year in New Zealand, so we're pretty keen to, and you might have some ideas of some things that could help prod that. But one of them is capacity building, which you touched on. And in a digital world, is there a move that you're aware of is to have a kind of global school or a place where these, because I know there is bits and pieces, but is there a global campus? Because, you know, I'm not sure of your experience, but in New Zealand, I mean, I see Charles Murfield on the line. The BHUs is still in existence. It's its 50th year this year. And for everybody, Nic was associated that when he was with New Zealand. But it's hanging on by the hair of its chinny chin chin. And there's no real global sort of school or place for learning and capacity building at all levels. Has there been any thought around that in the EU?
Yeah, there's been a fair bit of work over the last few years on building sort of online knowledge platforms. It's always a bit difficult when you try to do it globally, but to meet all the needs for different environments and so on. But given some of the compatibility between European and New Zealand agriculture, then there may be more scope to tune into that. But there are certainly initiatives taking place at the European level to have a knowledge platform specifically for organic. The whole area of recently, there's been a project which has launched a massive online training course for organic advisors with large numbers of participants, so that those are now becoming available. So I think that's an area we need to watch. It's going to happen, but even though these facilities are there, we need to find ways in which we can also talk face to face and deal with things locally. I sort of observed over time how more and more of the younger generation of organic farmers in the UK were getting their information from the United States rather than from neighbouring countries in Europe, where it might be geographically and climate-wise more relevant. So I think that's the sort of issue about how we bridge those sorts of things when we move to a more digital information world.
Cool. Very good.
I have a question for Nic. Nic, we've at various points in the last couple of years, we've sniffed around trying to access the Horizon funding. Have you seen any examples of organic related projects that, well, whether in the EU or outside the EU, that have actually accessed that funding stream and been able to do some work in that space?
There are a number of projects that are organic specific that are funded through the Horizon Europe program, and where New Zealand participation is theoretically possible. Some of those have been focused on issues to do with regulations and finding solutions to some of the problem parts of the organic regulations. There's also been a series of projects that have been focused more directly around use of legumes, for example, and developing that side of things. So I think there are opportunities and a need to be aware of the calls that are being developed. And I think the issue there is I'm not so much involved anymore now because I don't intend to be involved in the big program again. But it's important to get access to the drafts of the calls before they finally get published. If you wait until they're finally published, most of the people who are in the know will have already set up their consortia.
Yeah.
So you need to, and hopefully your New Zealand government people are in tune, and you need to make sure that the organic research community and yourselves are also able to link in and get access to the drafts. They leak very easily. I think they're probably leaked semi-officially in order to keep people informed. And you need to get access to those early drafts, even if they don't quite end up in exactly the same wording by the time they're finally published.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Count to 3. Right. Awesome. Thank you. That was great, Nic and Alistair. Thank you both very much for your time and energy and sharing of advice and insights, and those questions very helpful. Nic, a real pleasure to have you back in New Zealand, if only virtually. And when I spoke with Nic, you are on the edge of retirement, Nic. You're getting serious about retirement now.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I'll do a little bits of work for nice people, but I don't intend to have to work for institutions anymore and do all of the other things that go with that.
Right. We'll keep that in mind, Nic. And yeah. So look, thank you both, Nic, Alistair. Thank you so much for your time and energy tonight. And Lou, as always, great to have you supporting us and making sure we're all on track. And for all those attending, and for those who are going to listen later on, because we do know there's quite a lot of download that happens of this over time. That's also a very new way of doing things, which is great. And I think we can replay these and learn. There's some really good insights tonight. Nic, will those PowerPoints, could you share those with us? You'd be prepared. We can put those, Alistair.
Yeah,
you've got mine, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, just convert it to a PDF version before you.
Sure.
Perfect.
So take up less space. You're welcome to have it available.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, great evening, everybody. Thank you very much. All the very best. And if you're traveling, safe travels. And Pakiti anō. See you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Maria, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Nic. Thanks, Alistair. Brendan. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.